Tonight, we begin with a story that sits at the intersection of power, energy, and geopolitical leverage. The long and complicated standoff between the United States and Venezuela during the Trump administration. It was not a traditional military confrontation. There were no large-scale troop deployments or battlefield headlines. Instead, the conflict unfolded through economic sanctions, diplomatic recognition battles, oil markets, and strategic signaling. And at the center of it all was a fundamental question: can economic pressure reshape political power in another sovereign nation? When President Donald Trump took office, Venezuela was already in severe economic crisis. Years of heavy state control over industry, declining oil production, and structural mismanagement had pushed inflation to extraordinary levels. Basic goods were scarce. Millions of Venezuelans had begun leaving the country in search of stability elsewhere in Latin America. Politically, Nicolas Maduro's government faced accusations from opposition groups that electoral processes lacked legitimacy. International observers were divided, and Washington made its position clear early on. The Trump administration framed Venezuela not only as a humanitarian concern, but also as a strategic issue within the Western Hemisphere. Officials repeatedly described Maduro's leadership as authoritarian and argued that democratic institutions had eroded. But beyond the rhetoric, the administration's strategy relied heavily on economic instruments. Rather than pursue direct military engagement, Washington chose to weaponize financial systems and energy leverage, tools uniquely powerful in a globalized economy where access to U.S. markets and dollar transactions remains central to international trade. Oil became the primary pressure point. Venezuela possesses some of the largest proven crude reserves in the world. Historically, oil exports funded social programs, government payrolls, and infrastructure projects. By targeting the state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A., the United States aimed directly at the financial engine of the Venezuelan state. Sanctions restricted the company's ability to conduct transactions in U.S. dollars, limited access to American markets, and froze certain assets under U.S. jurisdiction. The expectation was straightforward: reduce revenue, increase internal strain, and force political recalculation. At the same time, the administration took the extraordinary step of recognizing opposition leader Juan Guaidó as interim president during Venezuela's political crisis in 2019. This diplomatic move signaled that Washington no longer recognized Maduro as the legitimate authority. Several allied nations followed suit, while others rejected the shift, creating an international divide. Recognition became a geopolitical tool in itself, not merely symbolic, but tied to control over certain financial assets and diplomatic channels. Sanctions expanded over time. Financial institutions dealing with Venezuelan sovereign debt faced restrictions. Individual officials were added to targeted sanction lists. The measures were layered and deliberate, designed to build sustained pressure rather than deliver a single economic shock. U.S. officials described the campaign as maximum pressure, a term reflecting both the intensity and persistence of the strategy. Yet, economic statecraft is rarely simple. Humanitarian organizations warned that broad sanctions risked worsening conditions for ordinary citizens. Although U.S. policy included humanitarian exemptions for food and medical supplies, the complexity of financial restrictions often made transactions difficult in practice. Critics argued that economic isolation might entrench political leadership rather than dislodge it, particularly if the government could redirect blame outward. Meanwhile, Venezuela's leadership sought ways to adapt. Oil shipments were redirected toward countries willing to transact outside traditional dollar systems. Alternative financial arrangements emerged. The confrontation evolved into a test of endurance. Could sustained economic isolation compel systemic political change, or would the targeted government find ways to survive under pressure? This was more than a bilateral dispute. It was a case study in modern geopolitical strategy, where financial networks, energy markets, diplomatic recognition, and regional alliances became instruments of influence. As we move deeper into this investigation, we will examine how the pressure campaign was constructed, how Venezuela responded, and what the broader implications were for U.S. foreign policy and the future use of economic power as a strategic weapon. The battle was not fought with tanks or airstrikes. It was fought with sanctions lists, oil contracts, and diplomatic declarations, and its impact continues to shape regional politics today. To understand how the maximum pressure strategy unfolded, we need to examine its architecture in detail. The Trump administration did not rely on a single sanction or announcement. Instead, it built a layered system of financial, energy, and diplomatic constraints designed to narrow Venezuela's economic maneuvering room step by step. The first layer involved financial markets. Executive orders restricted U.S. persons and institutions from participating in transactions tied to Venezuelan sovereign debt and certain government-issued bonds. This move limited Caracas's ability to refinance obligations or raise fresh capital in international markets. Access to the global financial system, especially transactions denominated in U.S. dollars, is a powerful economic tool. By constraining it, Washington aimed to isolate Venezuela from mainstream banking networks. The second and most impactful layer targeted the oil sector. In 2019, sanctions were imposed on PDVSA, effectively blocking its crude exports to U.S. refiners unless authorized under specific licenses. Because the United States had historically been one of Venezuela's largest customers, this shift forced immediate adjustments in trade flows. Revenue streams tightened. Logistical networks had to be rebuilt. Payment systems became more complex. But sanctions policy is rarely static. Over time, enforcement mechanisms expanded. The U.S. Treasury Department added individuals and entities to sanctions lists, citing corruption allegations or links to state structures. Asset freezes and travel bans were imposed. The objective was not only to restrict national income, but also to apply personal pressure to decision-makers within the Venezuelan political elite. Simultaneously, diplomatic signaling intensified. By recognizing Juan Guaidó as interim president, Washington effectively transferred recognition of certain Venezuelan state assets under U.S. jurisdiction to opposition control. This was a powerful symbolic and legal shift. It reshaped debates within international organizations and compelled governments across Latin America and Europe to clarify their positions. Yet economic isolation also triggered adaptation. Venezuela sought alternative buyers for its oil, particularly in markets less sensitive to U.S. sanctions. Barter arrangements and non-dollar payment mechanisms reportedly increased. Shipping routes shifted. Intermediaries played a larger role in facilitating transactions. These adjustments did not fully offset revenue losses, but they demonstrated that sanctions rarely produce total economic paralysis. Inside Venezuela, the economic contraction deepened an already severe crisis. Inflation soared to historic levels. Public services struggled, migration intensified, placing pressure on neighboring countries such as Colombia and Brazil. Regional governments found themselves balancing humanitarian response with political positioning regarding U.S. policy. Meanwhile, debate intensified within the United States. Supporters of maximum pressure argued that sanctions were a necessary response to democratic backsliding and corruption allegations. They contended that economic tools offered a way to avoid military intervention while still projecting strength. Critics countered that sanctions can entrench power structures by consolidating control over scarce resources and redirecting blame toward foreign actors. The strategic logic remained consistent. Sustained financial isolation would alter internal political calculations. But economic systems are dynamic. Leaders under pressure often seek alternative alliances. In Venezuela's case, relationships with countries outside the U.S. orbit became more prominent. These geopolitical alignments complicated enforcement and reduced the likelihood of swift political transformation. As the pressure campaign matured, it became clear that the confrontation was evolving into a prolonged contest. Each side tested the limits of endurance. Washington adjusted sanctions frameworks, Caracas adjusted trade routes and diplomatic messaging, and global energy markets watched carefully as shifts in Venezuelan output affected supply dynamics. This was not a short-term maneuver. It was a strategic marathon, one that would test whether economic leverage alone could drive structural political change. This was more than a bilateral dispute. It was a case study in modern geopolitical strategy, where financial networks, energy markets, diplomatic recognition, and regional alliances became instruments of influence. As we move deeper into this investigation, we will examine how the pressure campaign was constructed, how Venezuela responded, and what the broader implications were for U.S. foreign policy and the future use of economic power as a strategic weapon. The battle was not fought with tanks or airstrikes. It was fought with sanctions lists, oil contracts, and diplomatic declarations. And its impact continues to shape regional politics today. As the economic confrontation deepened, the geopolitical dimensions of the standoff became increasingly clear. Venezuela was not operating in isolation. Its leadership understood that survival under sanctions required more than internal adjustments. It required external partnerships, and those partnerships reshaped the strategic landscape of the Western Hemisphere. Russia and China, both with existing economic ties to Caracas, maintained varying degrees of engagement during periods of heightened U.S. sanctions. While neither country fully replaced Venezuela's lost access to Western financial markets, their continued interaction signaled that Washington's pressure campaign would not go uncontested. Energy cooperation, debt restructuring discussions, and diplomatic backing in international forums provided Caracas with alternative channels of support. For the Trump administration, this dynamic reinforced a broader geopolitical concern. Venezuela was viewed not only as a domestic governance issue, but also as part of a larger contest over influence in Latin America. U.S. officials frequently cited the presence of rival powers in the region as justification for a firm stance. In that sense, the pressure campaign carried strategic messaging beyond Venezuela itself. It was intended to demonstrate that Washington would respond decisively to governments seen as aligning against U.S. interests. At the same time, regional diplomacy evolved. Some Latin American governments supported Washington's recognition of opposition leadership, while others advocated dialogue and negotiated settlement. The Organization of American States became a venue for debate. European governments expressed support for democratic processes, but remained cautious about endorsing aggressive economic measures that might worsen humanitarian conditions. Meanwhile, migration became a defining regional consequence. Millions of Venezuelans fled economic hardship and political instability, creating one of the largest displacement crises in the Western Hemisphere. Neighboring countries faced strains on healthcare, housing, and employment systems. This humanitarian dimension complicated the narrative. It was no longer solely a political standoff between Washington and Caracas. It was a regional challenge affecting millions of lives. Inside Venezuela, the leadership tightened internal control structures. Economic contraction often concentrates authority around those managing scarce resources. Sanctions may weaken state revenue, but they can also consolidate political power if alternative economic channels remain accessible to ruling elites. Analysts debated whether maximum pressure was producing cracks or reinforcing centralized control. In Washington, policy discussions reflected these uncertainties. Could sanctions be recalibrated? Should humanitarian exemptions be expanded? Would incremental diplomatic engagement produce better outcomes than sustained isolation? These questions underscored the complexity of economic statecraft. Sanctions are blunt instruments. Their effects ripple unpredictably across domestic and international systems. Energy markets also factored into strategic calculations. Reduced Venezuelan output altered global supply patterns, though other producers often compensated. Oil prices are influenced by a range of variables: production decisions by OPEC members, geopolitical disruptions elsewhere, global demand shifts. In this broader context, Venezuela's constrained exports were one piece of a much larger energy puzzle. Ultimately, the standoff illustrated a broader lesson about power in the modern era. Economic dominance, particularly control over global financial systems and dollar-based transactions, offers enormous leverage. But leverage does not guarantee immediate transformation. Political systems under pressure adapt, recalibrate, and seek alternative alliances. The confrontation between Washington and Caracas became less about quick results and more about endurance. It tested whether sustained economic isolation could meaningfully alter a country's internal political trajectory without direct military engagement. And as the pressure campaign continued, the answer remained complex and contested. In the next phase of this analysis, we examine the long-term implications of maximum pressure for Venezuela, for U.S. foreign policy, and for the evolving role of sanctions as a central instrument of geopolitical strategy. This was more than a bilateral dispute. It was a case study in modern geopolitical strategy, where financial networks, energy markets, diplomatic recognition, and regional alliances became instruments of influence. As we move deeper into this investigation, we will examine how the pressure campaign was constructed, how Venezuela responded, and what the broader implications were for U.S. foreign policy and the future use of economic power as a strategic weapon. The battle was not fought with tanks or airstrikes. It was fought with sanctions lists, oil contracts, and diplomatic declarations, and its impact continues to shape regional politics today. By the later stages of the Trump administration, the Venezuela strategy had evolved from an urgent pressure campaign into a long-term policy posture. What began as an attempt to catalyze rapid political change became an extended test of economic endurance, diplomatic positioning, and strategic signaling. The question facing policymakers was no longer simply whether sanctions could trigger immediate reform, but whether sustained leverage would eventually shift internal calculations over time. One of the defining characteristics of the approach was its reliance on financial dominance rather than military force. The United States did not pursue large-scale intervention. Instead, it utilized control over banking channels, dollar clearing systems, and access to U.S. markets. In a global economy where the dollar functions as a primary reserve currency, restricting access to American financial infrastructure carries substantial weight. This was economic statecraft at scale. Yet the results were mixed. Venezuela's economy remained deeply strained. Oil production fluctuated but did not collapse entirely. Alternative trade networks emerged, albeit at higher costs and lower efficiency. The political leadership retained control of core institutions. International recognition battles continued in diplomatic forums. The expected rapid transition did not materialize. Critics of the strategy argued that sanctions often produce diminishing returns over time. Once a targeted country adapts to restricted conditions, additional measures may exert less incremental pressure. Supporters countered that abandoning pressure prematurely would remove leverage and legitimize governance structures Washington opposed. Another dimension was the domestic political environment within the United States. Venezuela policy became intertwined with broader debates about foreign intervention, democracy promotion, and executive authority. Lawmakers examined the humanitarian impact of sanctions while also weighing geopolitical competition in the hemisphere. The Venezuela case became a reference point in discussions about how America should project power without deploying troops. The humanitarian crisis also remained central. Inflation, shortages, and migration created regional instability that neighboring governments could not ignore. Economic isolation may weaken a government's revenue, but it also influences everyday citizens. Balancing strategic objectives with humanitarian considerations proved challenging. Humanitarian exemptions existed in policy design, yet the complexity of sanctions compliance often discouraged commercial actors from engaging even in permitted transactions. For Venezuela's leadership, survival under sanctions required adaptation. Political narratives framed economic hardship as external aggression. State messaging emphasized sovereignty and resistance. Meanwhile, selective economic adjustments, including limited market reforms in certain sectors, were introduced to stabilize revenue streams. In strategic terms, the confrontation underscored a broader transformation in global power dynamics. Modern geopolitical contests increasingly rely on financial tools rather than conventional warfare. Sanctions, export controls, asset freezes, and access restrictions have become central components of national strategy. The Trump administration's Venezuela policy reflected this shift, a belief that economic leverage could serve as a primary instrument of coercion. But coercion alone does not guarantee compliance. The case demonstrated that economic power is most effective when paired with coordinated international support and credible diplomatic pathways. Where international consensus is fragmented, targeted governments often exploit divisions to mitigate impact. In Venezuela's situation, geopolitical alignments limited the reach of unilateral pressure. As analysts evaluate the legacy of maximum pressure, several conclusions emerge. First, sanctions can significantly constrain economic capacity. Second, political outcomes are influenced by internal resilience and external alliances. Third, economic statecraft requires patience and constant recalibration. The U.S.-Venezuela standoff under President Trump became more than a bilateral dispute. It evolved into a real-world laboratory for modern coercive diplomacy. It revealed both the potency and the limitations of economic force in reshaping political realities. In the end, the strategy raised enduring questions. How far can financial leverage go without diplomatic settlement? When does pressure become counterproductive? And what balance should policymakers strike between strategic objectives and humanitarian consequences? Those questions continue to shape U.S. foreign policy debates today. The Venezuela episode remains a powerful illustration that in the 21st century, battles for influence are often fought not with weapons, but with economic tools, and their outcomes are rarely immediate or simple. This was more than a bilateral dispute. It was a case study in modern geopolitical strategy, where financial networks, energy markets, diplomatic recognition, and regional alliances became instruments of influence. As we move deeper into this investigation, we will examine how the pressure campaign was constructed, how Venezuela responded, and what the broader implications were for U.S. foreign policy and the future use of economic power as a strategic weapon. The battle was not fought with tanks or airstrikes. It was fought with sanctions lists, oil contracts, and diplomatic declarations, and its impact continues to shape regional politics today.